Hello and welcome back to the Game Room. You know what I love? Video games. You know what I love talking about? Games. And it seems like a lot of people who cover games these days seem to hate them, or at least hate the people who play them. Well, that's not me, and that's not the 1,549 of you beautiful people checking in today. Now, you know a company I always really liked? Quintet. Now I say that, but I didn't really like them growing up. I liked them in my older collecting life because, as you see, there's the Quintet Gaia trilogy, but there's also some other games made by this little company that's not Enix. It's a developer that was within Enix, or at least Enix published a lot of their games. And I really wanted to talk about a bunch of them. And it's quite an interesting story, especially the games that a lot of you guys have never even heard of, including myself, before I wanted to sit out and do this video. So if that sounds interesting to you, let's check it out after the intro. There's a lot of games out there, some of which you've never even heard of. That's where I come in. My name's Luke. I've been playing games since the age of 2, and I have no life.
This is my game room.
Alright, so a lot of people know of Quintet because of the Gaia trilogy, which is an unofficial trilogy. Back in the Super Nintendo days, you had Final Fantasy, you had Dragon Warrior, aka Dragon Quest in Japan, but you had a little company that made a lot of the memorable Enix games we all think of. And we're going to start off with the first one that came out first, I believe in 1992 or 93. People called it a Zelda clone, and to be fair, I covered it during my Zelda clone month a few years back, and that game is Soul Blazer. Now, Soul Blazer is an action game where you go through and you have these little cave things that release enemies. Once you kill all the enemies that are coming out of those zones, it will recover some of the land. That was the basis of what the Gaia trilogy is about. It's that you have a wasteland and you as the player are going through and bringing life back to it. So there's a lot of themes of life and rebirth and things of that nature. And in Soul Blazer, you have essentially a town building scenario where the more actions you do in the different lands, you then rebuild this town that you start off in. And it's a really enjoyable time, fun, solid game. Unfortunately for it, Link to the Past was already out, and calling it a Zelda clone in a lot of ways is a disservice. This was before the huge RPG craze really of the mid to late 90s occurred, and also it is a little archaic at times. The graphics aren't incredible, the control scheme isn't the best, but all in all, for Quintet's first release, now get into the history of the company a little bit. This wasn't their first release, actually their second release, but one of their earliest releases. You had it made from the guys who were heavily involved in the E series for the TurboGrafx. You have a guy named Tomoyoshi Miyazaki and then another gentleman named Masaya Hashimoto. So those were the two guys that founded Quintet, and because of their background in the E series, that's what got the amazing Yuzo Koshiro to do the soundtrack for their first game, which let's pivot to, and that first game was Actraiser. And even though this isn't part of the Gaia trilogy, there's still a lot of those bones in it where you're bringing life to a land, you play as a god character, you can shape the lives of these people, which those themes repeat themselves over and over and over again. And Actraiser is half sim and half action adventure game. It doesn't do a great job of either, but because it has both in the same package, it is full of charm and is just a really fun experience. And I want to say if it wasn't a launch title, it was very early on in the Super Nintendo's life cycle. And unfortunately, this was a game that I also found out about later in life. And a lot of people, when they think of Quintet games, they think of the trilogy. They don't necessarily mention Actraiser. Also, Enix was the publisher for almost all of their Super Nintendo releases. I think all of them, to be honest. All the ones that made it here in the West, at least. So you'd be forgiven for thinking that this was an Enix franchise. But yeah, Actraiser is the only one of any of these games that has gotten re-released. And what's funny is that Miyazaki, director of Quintet, disappeared. And even to this day, no one knows where he went. No one knows. I think he was seen at a party in 2015 at some random either Nintendo party or Square Enix party or something like that. And then since then, no one's heard from him again. So that's why the licensing and the rights of these titles is kind of up in the air. But the fact that they did just do an Actraiser Resurrection re-release makes people think that maybe Square Enix has it. But hey, there's still hope for those that eventual re-release of Terranigma, but we're not there yet. So yeah, Actraiser, another game I've covered on the channel. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Solid entry. I mean, almost every game we're going to talk about here is going to be a banger. But let's move on to the next game in the Gaia trilogy, which was the third release from Quintet, which is Illusion of Gaia. This is also known as Illusion of Time in other territories, and even had a big box variant in, I want to say, PAL regions. Illusion of Gaia, game I covered, I want to say 2 years ago now, in my opinion, is... I wouldn't say it's maybe Soul Blazer is the weakest of the trilogy, but I go back and forth. I really enjoyed Soul Blazer, but Illusion of Gaia is a solid action RPG. You go through and you traverse through lands that are familiar with our own history. So you go and see the Great Wall of China. You have a sort of Easter Island type head, Mayan structures, and not going to get into spoilers of the storyline, but it all does come together at the end. And again, your rebirth, your rebuilding, you have consequences happen in these games. You lose people die, bad things happen. The lovable pig sacrifices himself to a town of cannibals, but the people resorted to cannibal because they had no food. And there's real life situations that go on. And funnily enough, this was a game that was recently covered on an episode of The Completionist, to which they complained about the hidden red jewels, and that kind of gets into my dislike of completionist culture and achievement culture. I've almost made a video about this in general, but going through a game for a one playthrough or a first playthrough or even just a fun playthrough and feeling like you are restricted to having to get all these things robs it of its fun. Because one of the fun things about finding the red crystals is the fact that they are optional, and it's almost a badge of honor when you find them rather than a requirement. If you go into this game thinking that finding the red crystals is a requirement, because yes, there is an unlockable dungeon at the end of the game that has the hardest boss. It's actually a callback to Soul Blazer, which is cool. But that's what replay value was back in the 90s. That was replay value. You would buy the guide to get that, or you would look up stuff to find that, or you would just play through the game a bunch of times. And to go into it expecting to do that on a first playthrough, I think robs this game of a little bit of its magic, and I would advise against that. I would advise against playing any of these games with a guide, because they're all simple enough to get through without any instruction, and they're all fairly, I mean, I think 15 to 20 hour games. I mean, actraiser is much shorter than that. Illusion of Gaia, excellent game. Now, I mentioned this briefly on a few episodes ago, and that is by far the best game of the Gaia trilogy, which is Terranigma. Terranigma, a phenomenal game. The first game I covered on the channel by myself after the Treasure of the Rudress video, which is really just kind of a test pilot type thing. And you play as a character named Ark, who starts off in what you don't know is the underworld, but is the underworld, and then you gradually resurrect the entire world. And you find out later in the game that there's an alternate version, so there's a light version of Dark and a dark version of Dark, as well as every other character in the game, which I won't spoil how that affects things, but it does. And memorable bosses, memorable encounters. Bloody Mary is a bitch. You have a cool overrun town by zombies. And the combat, this is where they finally got it right. And sadly, I really do think if Terranigma had come out in the West, unfortunately, Enix America had shut its doors, and Nintendo, even though they published it in PAL regions, did not publish it in America. Most likely because it was a late release, and chipsets were super expensive, especially for, like, there's a reason why the N64 games and the Super Nintendo games were so much more expensive than PS1 games. Those were $50 versus $60 routinely. And just... such a fun game, though. They really nailed the combat. Now, there's a magic system in this that doesn't really factor into it much, which I didn't mind, but just such an enjoyable time. And to this day, I still would love to see a re-release of Terranigma. It is one of my favorite games of all time, and even though it didn't come out in America, I have so much nostalgia for this game already, even though I only beat it about 8 years ago. Okay, now the other two games on the Super Nintendo that you don't really think about that were from Quintet. One of them being the only sequel they ever did, the direct sequel, which was Actraiser 2. Now, I have yet to play Actraiser 2, but unfortunately, one of the things that made Actraiser so special was its melding of the simulation, the top-down, going around, dealing with the SimCity type stuff, with the action-adventure. And for this game, they foolishly listened to Enix America, and Enix America said, yeah, Americans don't like, they don't like that sim crap, get rid of it. And then they want a harder game that's not so easy to beat, so make make it balls hard. And what's funny is if you play this, it actually has really solid mechanics and is a very competent side scroller, but it's just so hard. And for people who like the first one, it's kind of what I would say with Toe Jam and Earl 1 versus Toe Jam and Earl 2 is. You took what made the game special and you removed it trying to appeal to an audience that may have been there, but you alienated the audience that was there. And if that doesn't sound like modern day, I don't know what is. And unfortunately, yeah, this tanked the only franchise that had any name recognition and probably made Quintet go down the line of not doing direct sequels. And that's probably what was really the cause of a lot of their downfall, because they didn't have the name recognition. Even the Gaia trilogy, no one knows those games are related. I didn't even know Terra Enigma existed. And then the last one that was on the Super Famicom or Super Nintendo was a little game called Slapstick in Japan, but here it was called Robotrek. And I have not played this yet. I've been holding off on it, and from what I know, it's very silly and very fun. I mean, the reason why it was called Slapstick in Japan, I think there's a little bit of Pocket Monsters type thing where you recruit enemies and use them that way, but yeah, I honestly, I know nothing about this game, other than I picked it up years ago, and it's the last Quintet game, but still, of the 5, or is it 5 or 6? Of the 6 on the Super Famicom, or Super NES, this one I think by far is the least recognized. And that was it, as far as I knew. That was those were the Quintet games. Well, turns out I was wrong. Quintet continued on into the 32-bit era, and if anything, was one of the first sacrifices on the 32-bit altar. Now, they left Nintendo. There are no more Quintet games on Nintendo platforms, but they did release games for the PS1 and also for the Dreamcast, the Saturn, and the PS2, although most of those were Japan-only exclusives. There was one game that we got that is from Quintet, although it was when they had a subsidiary named Shade within the company, and that game is called the Grand Stream Saga. In a lot of ways, this game combines a lot of elements from the Gaia trilogy and then translates them into 3D. Now, I actually just beat this game last week. I wanted something to play that was not super long before Tears of the Kingdom came out, and so I will probably put a video out with my thoughts on it, but just some initial thoughts on it. Very unique game, very warts and all. This is not perfect. It's interesting because you have a third-person perspective, and then you get into these one-on-one fighting things in an action RPG that put you into, it's only 1 versus 1, and you still have use of abilities. You can change your weapons, you can do all this other stuff, and there's a command prompts that allow you to unlock special abilities that do bonus damage. And you go to 4 different lands, and you have this thing on your arm that allows you to make things and copy them, which sometimes is not great because you'll grab an item off an altar and then it'll require you to have the item on the altar, so you actually have to grab the item and then decline picking it up, and then your armband will copy it. And there's a lot of issues with that, but you still have some of that Quintet magic, that deep storytelling. It's full of all these amazing anime cutscenes, but you can tell the wheels are starting to fly off a little bit. I mean, there's a reason why Enix didn't want to publish it. I believe Sony published it in Japan, and then THQ, of all people, published it here in America. But still, cheap game. I think I got it for $35 complete. You can still find it relatively cheaply, and if you're a fan of the other Quintet games, this is a must-play. This is a must-play just for the novelty alone, and it is still very, very cool, and you have multiple endings. I mean, not crazy multiple endings, but there is an option at the end of the game that gives you a multiple ending, and so, big plus. All right, so that's the last of them, right? Wrong. Well, funnily enough, they released 2 games for the Sega Saturn, and because of this, I have bought my first ever Sega Saturn game. And I always thought it would be Elevator Action Returns, but it's not. It's a little game called Solo Crisis. So this is an extremely obscure game made by Quintet that I want to say the closest thing to it would be imagine the sim part of actraiser, but instead of being the all-powerful god character, you don't have the action-adventure sequences. And then you're watching over these guys in almost a populist style map view. and the characters can proliferate. You can use your god powers to raise land and lower land and put in all the different acts of everything. But there's the ability for the world to be turned, so you go through these holes and the world turns upside down, and now instead of being peaceful land, you're in the upside down, and that's where monsters are and all these other crazy things and more resources. And that's really all I could find out about the game. There's very, very little information on it, and I don't have a Saturn, and I don't have a way of playing this, but as a huge fan of Quintet, and this essentially looks, from what I've read, it's kind of like a mix of turn-based tactical gameplay, because once you encounter the enemies, much like Grand Stream Saga, you go into a combat phase. And so it's a mix of that with some of the god abilities that you would get in the sim portion of Actraiser. While I get that makes it incredibly niche for myself, that makes it sound incredibly cool to check out. Unfortunately, I have no way of checking out, so maybe one day I'll be able to try it. But yeah, I wanted to pick it up because it's only about 15 bucks. As rare as it is, it's a fairly cheap game, and hey, I now have a Sega Saturn game in my collection, which like I said, I didn't see that happening. Still don't have any US released Saturn games, but I got that. Just like I have the no turbo games, but I have Rondo of Blood. Go figure. Alright, now, they made another game on the Saturn, which I don't have. It's actually a racing RPG game called Code R. I don't know much about it. I wanted to pick up a copy of it, but I just couldn't, and I didn't want to wait for it to do this video. But yeah, that's another one that's, once again, got a unique spin. But yeah, it's just a racing game with a little bit of RPG elements in between the races. Now, here's a game that I would say is almost a spiritual successor to Grand Stream Saga that was also released on the PS1. And what's funny is that a local game store when I was in the Bay Area actually had a copy of this on their store, and I never picked it up because I just had no interest in it. But when I looked into the Quintet library, I saw this game, which is similar to the way Grand Stream Saga behaves, but then you have a light and dark mechanic where you're almost, I don't think it's like Shadow of the Damned, but that's the closest thing I can think of, and it's called Brightus. And another game that I'm sure wouldn't have done great out here, I mean, PS1 wise, but still another Quintet game that it's on PS1 import. So yeah, once again, I now have 3 PS1 imports. I have this Tyrian Saga, and then another game we're going to get to in a second. But just standard fare. You're some heavenly knight who's going through and having to stop the demons and whatnot and bring light to the darkness. If it plays anything like Grand Stream Saga, I'd be interested in checking it out. And just another novelty of the Quintet library, because at a certain point around this time frame, it's hard to know exactly what they did and what they helped with. It shows that Quintet helped on Shenmue, which I have no idea what the hell they did on Shenmue. It shows they helped on, or they made a Godzilla fighting game for the Saturn, which I can't find any information on. Other games that were made by Shade, that Shade eventually split off from Quintet, but it was a game called Orphan Scion of Sorcery that I don't know what they were involved with, but this is a game that they had. And I think the last game they ever made was Inuyasha for the PS2 in 2004. And then after that, Quintet just disappeared. And even they, like, no one knows. Like I said, the guy who made it, they just disappeared. But the last game we're going to talk about is probably one that I find the most interesting and I would love to try out. It has tank control, so already it looks like a good time. And that is a game for the PS1 made by Quintet, not Shade, actually Quintet, and that is Planet Laika. And if you guys know your Russian cosmonaut history, you will know that Laika was the name of the dog that was sent up into space and allegedly lived, from what I've heard, allegedly lived. Well, this is a game that takes place where you play as a dog creature, like dog humanoid creature, who has schizophrenia. And you can sometimes be a normal guy, you can be a super buff dog, or another type of crazy dog. And it's got tank controls, and it very much, it's not psychological horror, but probably has a little survival horror feel to it, but with that Quintet flavor. And that really sounded interesting to me. So I imported it. I probably won't be able to play it. I'll have to mod my PS1 Mini or something, maybe get a ROM to work, because there's that game and then another game by Human Entertainment, which I want to check out. But yeah, that sounds very interesting, and that was it. Then they were gone. A victim of the 32-bit era. So that is my little video to Quintet, one of my favorite publishers that I found late in life. Let me know what you guys think of the Quintet games. Let me know if you have any experience with some of the Shade games or some of these imports, and if they look interesting to you, check them out. There are ways to sail the seven seas. I think a lot of them do have translations. I know Planet Lake it does as of a couple of years ago. So there you go, guys. That's what you get for this week. As a reminder, I do have a Patreon. Thank you all for subscribing. Thank you all for checking out the channel. It really does mean the world to me to be able to talk to you guys on this weekly basis. I have taken a break from Tears of the Kingdom to put this together. If you're playing that, hopefully you're enjoying it. I will say, I started off a little tepid on it. I loved Breath of the Wild, but going back into it, with the changes, it was a little bit of a, oh my god, let's get through this intro so we can get to the game. But now that I'm in the exploration phase, I'm having a ball with it. But yeah, that's what we got for this week, guys. As a reminder, put a video out every Tuesday. It's been so nice getting a hold of you. Take care.